these places have remained the same for hundreds of years. In America, if something is 100 years old, we tear it down and make a parking lot out of it. But over there, the person can walk down the street or go into an ancient cathedral, an ancient building, and be overcome by these feelings of, I've been here before. One man said when he walked into a certain cathedral in England, he began crying. He had a lot of emotion, and he couldn't figure out why. But it was very likely he had walked back into a place that he had lived in another lifetime. Many of you have had these experiences, even though you don't believe in reincarnation. The feeling of deja vu, like I've been here before, I've done this before, and it's all very familiar. But I had one man that came to me as a client who it happened to him in Egypt by the pyramids. And he had had no desire to go to Egypt. He didn't even have much of an interest in it. But he was over in Europe on vacation, and his relatives said they had some tickets. They wanted to take him to Egypt to see the pyramids as part of his trip. And like I said, he wasn't really that interested in it. But when he got there, and they were with all the tourists, the what's called the Giza Plateau is right in front of the pyramids, which is packed with tourists and people. There were busloads of people in the buses sitting all over the place. And he was with his wife, and they'd gone off, and he was trying to catch up with them. He was walking across the Giza Plateau. I think that's the name of the place. I haven't been there yet. I probably will be sometime. He was walking across the plateau toward the pyramid, when all of a sudden, it was as though he stepped through a time portal, or he stepped through some kind of a time barrier. And he was there at the time the pyramids were being built, when they were new. And he was overcome with emotion. It was just a strange feeling. It was like, I'm home, I'm home. And I wrote about this story in my book, Convoluted Universe, Book 1, where I was talking about the building of the pyramids and the ancient mysteries. But he was overcome with emotion of, even though it didn't look like it did today, is I'm here, I'm home. Well, then, it only lasted for a short period of time, and when he took the next step, all of a sudden, all of the noise and everything came rushing back in, and there were all the people and the buses that were there. It was no longer an empty plateau. And his wife came running up to him because they'd been separated. She didn't know where he was. She came running up to him, and he said he was standing there crying, and she couldn't figure out why. And he said, because I went home. So that's a case of deja vu where it triggered a very powerful event where he actually stepped through and went back into that time period. Another woman who came to me happened in the United States, which is usually unusual, like I said, because we don't have things that are that old here. It happened down in Fort Smith, Arkansas, about 50 miles from where I live. There's a famous old courthouse and prison down there. It has to do with a famous hanging judge, Parker, who hung a lot of people during the Civil War and right after the Civil War. It's a very infamous place, and now they have a museum there. But this woman came to me because she had this fear of having her hands bound and of... She couldn't sleep all night. She was waking up about every hour on the hour for many years. She couldn't sleep. And this feeling of claustrophobia, of being closed in, she couldn't stand any of that. And she wanted to know where this was coming from. But she said she'd had a strange experience when she went to Fort Smith. This is before coming to me. She had gone to Fort Smith to see this museum and the famous old prison. And she said when she was in the museum, she knew there was something underneath that floor that there were cells down there and there had been people down there. And that was all she could find out. They had pictures in the museum of the famous people. She said the one picture of Judge Parker didn't trigger anything, but one of the pictures of the hangmen that were there, that made her very emotional. There was something about it that was very familiar. So when we did her session, she went back there, and it was during the Civil War. And they were the Confederates, and some of these men had been captured, and they were being held prisoner there in the jails. And she was someone who really didn't want to go to war. She just went because everybody else was doing it, and she joined the crowd. She wasn't because of belief systems or anything. She just joined up and went with the rest of them. So here she was. They had captured them, and they took them into a dungeon-like situation. Some of them were tied to the walls with chains, and they were so crowded in there, very claustrophobic area with little tiny windows, and it was dark and damp and very depressing with all these people, and they were extremely frightened. And, because many of these were hanged without any kind of a trial, really. And they were all crowded into this area underneath there. And naturally, you're not going to be able to sleep crowded together like that, and some of them being chained to the walls, only a few cots. There are just so many people there. And then also the fear must have been raw all night long, because they all knew something was going to happen. They were all terrified, so naturally they weren't going to be able to sleep. And this was what happened. The next day, many of them were taken out and hung. And she was one of the men who were taken out and hung. And this was this feeling of deja vu when she went back there was that, I know this place, I know there's cells underneath this building. But during the session, part of the reason for bringing this memory back was that the subconscious wanted to tell her, you don't have to follow the pack anymore. You don't have to do what everybody else is doing. Just because they're doing it doesn't mean you have to. You can be your own person, and you can stand up for what you believe in and what you want to do. That's what it was trying to tell her, because her life had been going down that way. She was not standing up for herself. She was just doing what everybody else was wanting her to do. So those were two cases I had of deja vu. And of course, those are only very few of the ones that I've done. And some of you may identify with that because you have been to places where you have had these similar feelings of, I know I've been here before, there's something very familiar about this. I get so many emails and so many phone calls that people, many of them say, I've got such a strange story to tell you, I can't tell anybody else because they're going to think I'm crazy. But they can tell me because they know I won't be judgmental, and I tell them, there isn't anything you can tell me that I will think is strange because I feel I've heard it all. Very, very weird things. But as soon as I say that, I think I've heard it all, well then I get something else that's new and different. So I can't say I know it all. I just try to put it into place. And with my new books, The Convoluted Universe, I'm getting so many strange theories that I know I've only touched the surface in these things. Okay, let me go into a few more cases that were different and unusual. One was a woman who came to me who lost her sense of smell. She lost it when she was a child, and she'd never been able to smell anything since then. So we were trying to find out what happened with that. She went back to a lifetime where she was one of these healers. You know, in those old days, there were many, many of these. I think every village, every place had their granny woman. They had what was called witches. They had people that worked with oils and herbs, as well as the tribes that had their shamans and medicine men. This was an accepted part of life. But in many of those times, they made one mistake, and then they were either burned at the stake, or they were hung, or they were killed in some way. Because although they needed these people, they were not very tolerant of them, because they had a fear of them, because they knew they could do harm as well as good. And so many of these people were feared. And I've had many, many cases where they were burned or hung or killed in various ways. Then, when they come back in this life and they have this interest in reviving that, they know they have an interest in metaphysical knowledge, they know they have an interest in herbs and oils, but they're afraid, and they don't know why they're afraid. It's because they were killed for having this knowledge in another life. And even though now we know they're not going to be killed for it, it's actually all coming back, still in that part of their mind there's a fear, and that's what I have to deal with and take away so they'll be able to pursue what they're really looking for. Well, this woman went back to a life to where she was one of these women in this village. She lived out in the woods, and she would go out in the woods and gather the herbs and gather the roots to make her potions. And she had big pots cooking all the time that smelled awful of all of these ingredients she put together. And there were lines of people that were coming constantly to get these different potions, and they were very effective. But she was so tired of this, and she especially was so tired of the smell of the pots boiling and all of the things that were in them, that she was very glad when she got out of that life. She said, now I'm not going to have anything to do with that anymore. I don't want it. She had no desire to bring it back into this life. So it was fine until she was about 5 years old, and her grandmother came to visit with her. And she had a cold, and some of the other ones, the children in the house, had a cold. Her grandmother was cooking up a potion, an old-time remedy on the stove of different natural ingredients from the old-timers. I know my grandmother used to use camphor a lot and was very effective against sore throats and colds. But her grandmother was preparing something on the stove, and the pot was boiling, and the smells were going all over the house. That's when the little girl lost her sense of smell. It was the association between that and the unpleasant life she had, where she was more or less trapped into a situation that she didn't like. She associated the two things together, the two smells, and it took away her sense of smell in this lifetime. Well, then I had to do a lot of work with the subconscious memories to allow her sense of smell to come back, because I always say this happened in the past. It's from the past, it belongs in the past, and we leave it in the past. We only bring